It was winter. Francis and Friar Leo had been walking for hours in the snow, soaked, hungry, their feet cut by the ice. 2 kilometers of walking, during which Francis listed, one by one, everything that is not perfect joy. Friar Leo, if all our friars set an example of holiness in all the lands of the world, write that in this is not perfect joy. Friar Leo, if the lesser friar cured the blind, cast out demons, raised the dead of 4 days, write that in this is not perfect joy. Friar Leo, if we knew all languages, all sciences, all scriptures, and prophesied the secrets of consciences, write that in this is not perfect joy. After 2 kilometers like this, Friar Leo, perplexed, asked, Father, then where is perfect joy? And Francis replied, when we arrive at the convent, soaked, cold, hungry, and knock on the door, and the porter comes out enraged and says, who are you? And we say, we are 2 of your friars. And he says, lies. You are 2 rascals who deceive the world, and does not open for us, and leaves us in the snow until night. If we endure this with patience and joy, thinking that that porter truly knows us, and that God makes him speak thus against us, Friar Leo, write that here is perfect joy. And if he still comes out with a knotted stick, grabs us by the hood, throws us in the snow, and beats us not by not, if we endure all this with joy, thinking of the sufferings of Christ that we must bear for his love, Friar Leo, write that here and in this is perfect joy. The episode from the Fioretti ends with a theological conclusion that Francis considered the most important of his life. Above all the graces of the Holy Spirit is that of conquering oneself and enduring sufferings for the love of Christ. Because in the gifts of God we cannot boast, they are not ours. But in the cross of tribulation, we can boast. The porter did not recognize him because Francis was unrecognizable, soaked, covered in mud, frozen, hungry. But the deeper lesson is another. Francis taught that holiness is not in the miracles we perform, nor in the knowledge we accumulate, nor in the good we do. It is in how we endure unjust suffering with love. How did a rich, vain, and party-loving young man come to this wisdom? How did the son of a silk merchant become the madman of God, the most beloved saint in history, whose life was so radical that even today it challenges our understanding of what it means to be Christian? To understand the magnitude of this transformation, we need to look at who Francis was before. Born in Assisi, Italy, around 1181, he was baptized Giovanni. But his father, Pietro di Bernardone, a prosperous cloth merchant who frequently traveled to France, began to call him Francesco, the Frenchman. And Francis lived like a prince. He was the king of Assisi's youth, the leader of parties, fascinated by troubadours and chivalric culture. He spent money extravagantly, wore the finest silks, and dreamed of military glory. The turning point was not a magical moment of enlightenment, but a brutal shock with reality. In 1202, seeking glory, Francis joined a military expedition against the rival city of Perugia. The Battle of Collestrata was a disaster. Francis was captured and spent an entire year rotting in a damp, dark dungeon. There he contracted a severe illness that almost killed him and forced him to confront the fragility of his existence. Still, vanity took a long time to die. After being freed and recovering, he tried military life again. But on the way, an encounter changed everything. He saw a noble knight who had fallen into extreme poverty. Moved by a sudden and overwhelming compassion, Francis took off his own luxurious cloak and gave it to the man. That same night, he had a mysterious dream that made him turn back and return to Assisi, abandoning his dreams of earthly glory forever. The definitive test of his conversion, however, was the most repulsive possible. Francis always had a physical dread, almost a phobia, of lepers. The smell, the sight of the wounds, everything in him screamed to flee. One day, riding around Assisi, he came across a leper whose wounds were particularly terrible. His instinct was to turn his horse and flee. But the grace of God impelled him. He dismounted, walked to the man, and instead of just throwing a coin, he embraced him and kissed his festering wounds. In that kiss, Francis's world turned upside down. What once caused him nausea transformed, in his own words, into sweetness for the soul and for the body. He had kissed Christ himself, disguised in human misery. The confirmation of his calling came shortly after in the small ruined chapel of San Damiano. While praying before a Byzantine crucifix, Francis heard a clear and unmistakable voice coming from the cross. "Francis, go and rebuild my church, which as you see is falling into ruin." Taking the order literally, the young man began to carry stones with his own hands to repair the little chapel. To finance the work, he sold fabrics from his father's shop. Pietro di Bernardone, furious at what he considered theft and ashamed of his son's beggar-like behavior, dragged Francis before the Bishop of Assisi. He demanded the return of the money and the renunciation of his inheritance. Francis's response shocked the entire city. Before the bishop and the crowd, he not only returned the money, but took off all his clothes, standing completely naked. "Until now I have called Pietro di Bernardone Father," he declared, "but from now on I will only say, 'Our Father who art in heaven.'" The bishop, moved, covered Francis's nakedness with his own cloak. The break was total. The rich heir was dead. The poverello, the little poor man of Assisi, was born. Francis adopted the clothing of the poorest peasants of Umbria, a coarse wool tunic tied with a rope. He began to preach in the streets, not with the complex theology of academics, but with an ardent passion and a simplicity that touched hearts. Here it is important to clarify a historical detail that surprises many people. Francis was never a priest. He was ordained a deacon, the degree immediately preceding the priesthood, but deliberately refused to advance out of humility. He considered himself unworthy to celebrate the Eucharist. The Franciscan order was founded as an order of brothers, not a clerical order. Most of the early friars were laymen, like Francis. Over time, many were ordained priests to meet pastoral needs, but the founder remained a deacon until his death. This explains why Francis preached with such passion and frequency. Preaching is one of the proper functions of a deacon, and he did indeed preach with words. There is a famous phrase attributed to him: "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." It is a beautiful phrase, but Francis never said it. There is no historical record of it in his writings or in medieval sources. What does exist, however, is that Francis believed that the testimony of life was inseparable from words. For him, preaching without living what one preaches was pure hypocrisy. But words were essential. He used them with ardor and frequency. Soon other men, inspired by his joy in absolute poverty, began to follow him. In 1209, with 11 companions, Francis went to Rome to ask Pope Innocent III for approval of his new way of life. The rule he presented was shockingly simple: live the gospel strictly, possessing absolutely nothing. The Pope and his advisors found the idea impractical and dangerous. How could men survive without property or income? But tradition says that the Pope had a dream that night. He saw the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the mother church of Rome, about to collapse, being supported on the shoulders of a small and insignificant man dressed in rags, Francis. Recognizing the hand of God, Innocent III verbally approved the order of Friars Minor. Francis's worldview was revolutionary. He did not see nature as something to be dominated, but as a mirror of the Creator. He called all creatures brothers and sisters. The famous story of Francis preaching to the birds is not just a cute fairy tale. It is the expression of a profound theology where all creation participates in redemption. The same love extended to the feared. In Gubbio, a fierce wolf terrorized the city, killing animals and people. Instead of hunting it, Francis went to meet it. Making the sign of the cross, he called the animal Brother Wolf and made a pact. The city would feed it and it would stop attacking. The wolf, meek as a lamb, placed its paw in Francis's hand. More than a miracle over an animal, it was a lesson on how peace and compassion can tame ferocity, whether in nature or in the human heart. But Francis's zeal was not limited to Italy. He ardently desired martyrdom and the conversion of Muslims. In 1219, during the bloody Fifth Crusade, he traveled to Egypt, where the Christian army was besieging the city of Damietta. Horrified by the carnage and immorality of the Crusaders themselves, Francis decided to do the unthinkable. He crossed enemy lines unarmed to preach to Sultan al-Kamil. It was a suicide mission. As soon as they crossed the lines, they were captured, beaten, and chained by the Saracen soldiers. The reward for a Christian head was a gold bezant, but Francis cried out incessantly, "Sultan! Sultan!" Intrigued, the soldiers took him to al-Kamil. nephew of the great Saladin. The ensuing encounter is one of the most extraordinary moments in medieval history. The Sultan, a cultured and chivalrous man, expected diplomats or warriors, not a ragged beggar. It is said that, to test him, the Sultan had a carpet with crosses drawn on it laid out. If Francis stepped on it, he would insult his god. If he refused, he would insult his host. Francis walked over the carpet without hesitation. There were 3 crosses on Calvary, he explained. Christ's we adore. Those of the thieves, we leave for you, so I don't mind stepping on them. The Sultan was fascinated. Francis preached the gospel with such passion that Al-Kamil invited him to stay. Francis then made an audacious proposal, the trial by fire. Light a great fire, I and your priests will enter it. He whose God protects him will prove which is the true faith. The Sultan's imams, terrified, immediately refused and fled the tent. Then I will enter alone, Francis insisted. If I burn, it is because of my sins. If I survive, will you accept Christ? The Sultan, fearing a revolt from his people, refused, but his respect for the Poverello became a genuine friendship. He offered treasures to Francis, who refused them all, accepting only an ivory horn. Francis departed in peace, with the safe conduct from the Sultan. Years later, this friendship would guarantee the Franciscans the exclusive right to be the guardians of the holy places in Jerusalem, a privilege they maintain to this day. And Francis's missionary spirit did not die with him. 60 years after this scene in Egypt, a young Portuguese Franciscan would follow in the master's footsteps to where no Christian had gone before, to 13th century China. If you haven't yet watched the episode about John of Montecorvino, the man who founded the Catholic Church in China, the link is in the video description. Francis's last years were marked by physical suffering and spiritual anguish. The order had grown too fast, reaching thousands of friars. Many wanted to soften the rule, have comfortable convents, and focus on academic studies, moving away from radical poverty. Francis, feeling he was losing control of his own foundation, resigned from leadership and increasingly withdrew into solitude. In September 1224, Francis withdrew to Mount Alverna for a 40-day fast. He prayed asking for 2 things: to feel the pain Christ felt on the cross and the love that led him to endure it. The answer came in the form of a seraphim, a 6-winged angel, bearing the image of the crucified Christ. In a moment of mystical ecstasy and excruciating pain, the miracle happened. Francis became the first documented case in Christian history of a person to receive the stigmata, the physical marks of the crucifixion. They were not just scars. Eyewitness accounts, such as that of Brother Leo, describe dark flesh growths that looked like nails piercing his hands and feet, and an open wound in his side that bled constantly, staining his tunic. The man who wanted to imitate Christ in everything now bore his wounds in his own body. The pain of the stigmata was added to other illnesses. Francis contracted malaria and trachoma, an eye infection that left him almost blind. The medical treatments of the time were barbaric. The bishop ordered his eyes to be cauterized with red-hot irons. Francis, calling fire "Brother Fire," endured the procedure without a cry. In the autumn of 1226, knowing that the end was near, he asked to be taken to the Porciuncula, the little chapel where it all began. On his deathbed, he dictated his testament, imploring the friars never to abandon absolute poverty. As a final act of dispossession, he asked to be stripped and laid naked on the bare earth, to die possessing absolutely nothing, imitating his Lord until his last breath. Singing Psalm chapter 141 and welcoming Sister Death, Francis of Assisi passed away on the night of October 3, 1226, at the age of 44. Just 2 years later, he was canonized by Pope Gregory IX. The legacy of St. Francis is incalculable. He not only founded a religious order, he rescued the essence of the gospel in an era of wealth and corruption. He taught us that true joy is not in what we possess, but in what we are capable of enduring for love. He showed us that peace is built with vulnerability, not with weapons, and that all creation is sacred. St. Francis of Assisi was the madman of God, and his madness, the madness of unconditional love, radical poverty, and boundless compassion, is exactly the sanity our world desperately needs. The light that shone in Assisi did not fade with Francis's death. It ignited flames in hearts around the world. One of these hearts belonged to a young noblewoman from Assisi, the same city as Francis, who heard him preach when she was just 18 and decided to give up everything. She fled her home in the early morning, cut her hair, put on a coarse habit, and founded a new religious order. She was the first woman in the history of the church to write a religious rule approved by the Pope, and she spent 42 years without ever leaving the convent. And yet the whole world came to her. Learn the story of St. Clare of Assisi in our next episode. Subscribe